We're talking today, the topic is that there are no more early adopters of Agile. And on the one hand, that seems like it has to be true. It's been 20 years. But on the other hand, it still feels a little disappointing to encounter that thought face to face. That none of the people we're going to meet when we visit companies or try to change the people who work with us now are going to be coming from the same place that people 20 years ago or 15 years ago were. So what is it about early adopters, and why do we think people got so involved in Agile 20 years ago when they were the early adopters? What was the motivation then?
Cool. So when we say there are no more early adopters, that I want to be really clear that we're talking, when we say that, we're talking about it in a specific sense, that it's impossible for people to adopt Agile today just because the context is so completely different. And we'll talk about why that is. But you hit on really the big thing, which is that the motivations have changed kind of in a core way. Early on, when you hit innovators and early adopters, those are people who are free from certain pressures. When something is brand new, nobody knows about it. There aren't any, models to follow. There aren't any things. They're in almost a real discovery phase. And then the early adopters, the people who come across that discovery, are grabbing it because it's making real improvements to their context, right? They are all about process improvement. They're all about productivity. They're all about effectiveness, those sorts of things. And they're able to adapt that to their context because they have to, because there aren't models to follow. There aren't pressures to do it certain ways. So that's the early adopter, innovator side of things.
Well, I would add that I think there's probably a higher tolerance for ambiguity, a higher tolerance for risk, more interest in being on the cutting edge and being seen to be on the cutting edge. So there's in some ways I don't want to say profile, but there are some characteristics that are true of people who are early adopters. They want to try the new thing. They want to experiment with it, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely people who have a core identity of innovator, right? Yeah. Who have a core, who definitely have that. And I work with Joshua Karyevsky, who is somebody who has a core identity of innovator, who is always looking for a new and better way to do things. He's definitely an innovator, early adopter sort of person. I think a lot of in fact, they had to be a lot of the people who were early in the Agile movement before it was named Agile, the Kent Becks, the Martin Fowlers, all of these people were looking for, hey, what's the next best thing that we can figure out?
And it was sort of a confluence of a bunch of different factors that came together that enabled, Agile to emerge the way it did. I mean, it wasn't just, people sitting around thinking about it. It was the languages and the development environments and various things like that allowed it to emerge.
And then if you look at things on the completely other end of the scale, which are the extreme late adopters. And if you think about what motivates extreme late adopters to adopt something, what we know from years of research is that these are the people who are not going to adopt something unless there is extreme legitimacy pressure to do it. You know, they have an old way of doing things. They are very comfortable in that they have a huge amount of legitimacy pressure to do it the old way. And they're not going to change. In fact, some of them will never change, but most of them are not going to change unless they have even greater pressure from certain things, which are and now, of course, I'm blanking on the words, but rules or laws, the regulative pressure. You know, if a law changes that says you have to change the way you're doing things, that will push an extreme late adopter to follow the law. Professional norms, if their entire profession is, you know, changes around them, and the norms of the other people that they respect are the pressure becomes so great to change, then they will change. And the other is if they get into such great uncertainty that they just don't know what to do because what they're doing is failing so badly, then they will start looking for models to follow for what is working for other people. All three of those pressures come down to a core of legitimacy seeking, that they're looking for something that's legitimate. So when we talk about, there are actually two sets of theories. One is diffusion of innovation theory, which is how adoption happens from an innovation in. And then the flip side of that coin is institutional theory, which is when something goes from new and the great thing to taken for granted. There are certain innovations that are so taken for granted that we don't even think about them anymore. They're just part of how you do business. You know, bureaucracy was the first one of these that was studied. It was actually coined, the term was coined by Weber, and it's actually what started institutional theory studies. So these sorts of things, and those are the two ends. This was popularized by an author named Moore, who wrote a book called Crossing the Chasm. And so most people have seen that kind of diffusion of innovation S-curve and are familiar with it, and the adoption curve from Moore's work. It's actually a popularization of another researcher named Rogers, who has been looking at this stuff since the 1940s. And then the institutional theory stuff comes from the 1970s from a couple people, professors at Stanford, Meyer and Rowan, and then were expanded on, has been expanded on repeatedly since then, since the 1970s. So these are well-studied things well before Agile happened.
So I'm wondering, we heard the phrase extreme late adopters. I have my guess about whether that's what we're looking at today. Is that what we're looking at today? Are we in the
That is
extreme late adoption?
not what we're looking at today. Okay. We're probably, when I first joined the Agile community, I went to a conference, the Big Agile conference, and I heard people talking about, has Agile crossed the cavern? And I kind of giggled to myself, because the fact that we were at an international conference on Agile, by definition, meant we had crossed the chasm, like no question about it. There's literally no question at that point. Because, you know, when I was talking about the pressures for early adopters versus majority and late majority and all of that, early adopters don't have regulation around what they're doing. And when I was talking with Esther, she was like, well, Agile doesn't really have regulation. It's like, no, it really does. You know, by the time, because regulation isn't just laws, it's not just rules. She actually in our conversation brought up the Scrum Guide. The Scrum Guide is a set of regulations around Agile. It's not hugely enforced, but it is a written set of, this is how you should do things.
But there are other things, like there's the playbooks that come out from some of the big consulting firms. There are certain agencies that say you must be doing Agile to get a contract with us. So those are all regulatory things. But I think that I think the sort of mimetic pressures, the pressure to conform, that's been around for probably at least 10 years. Because I was talking to people 10 years ago who were saying, well, we want to know what our competitors are doing so we can keep up with our competitors relative to Agile. So they were not actually directly referring to some problem they wanted to solve. They were referring to, we want to know, we want to, do what other people are doing. So it's, that aspect of that particular pressure has been around for quite a few years.
So to turn that on its head, one thing that I don't think I've ever seen with extreme programming is people claiming to do it and not doing it. And with Agile, at least where we are on the adoption curve, we do see a lot of that. It's a regular English word. It sounds respectable. It confers legitimacy, like you've been saying. And I guess there's enough wiggle room in what precisely it means, whereas extreme programming is pretty prescriptive, that people could say that they do it because they don't want to say that they don't do it. And that's a different case than it would be early in the adoption curve. So how do we say we don't take into account that the context has changed, and we try to make our change efforts the same way that we would 20 years ago? Because, each person that meets this idea, it's going to be new to them, maybe. But organizationally, it's not going to be new to anybody. Let's say we put on our horse blinders and don't worry about that. What kinds of challenges might we encounter in our change efforts?
So you have three different things there to address, and I'm going to take them one at a time. The first one, you brought up XP, and I'm going to say something really controversial here because I am on the extreme end of extreme programming sort of stuff. I never want to be more than 5 minutes from going home. I commit all the time. I love mastering my tools, all of those things. The thing that I hate saying is that extreme programming didn't win, right? So when we're talking about diffusion of innovation, what happens is that early on, you have a number of different models that come out, a number of different variations that come out to fit different people's contexts. And you will, early on in that kind of crossing the chasm phase, you will see a few dominant forms emerge. Quick guesses, as I'll give you 3 guesses, 2 don't count, right? As to what dominant form in Agile emerged, right? That's going to be the Scrums and the safes. We don't hear about crystal clear anymore. We don't hear as much about XP anymore. Those sorts of things, because they were not the dominant form that emerged as legitimate in the Agile space. Now, that's not true in some small sections. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's another thing going on there, which I saw happening even early on, is that people tend to copy the external forms. So, and this is true of any sort of benchmarking. It's not just Agile. I mean, you look around at the world and, oh, those people are doing something really great. Let's adopt that. And they adopt the parts that are easy to see, easy to make explicit, easy to copy, but they may not take on the parts that are difficult, complex, have to do with changing the way you think about things, changing, on a deep level how you approach development, which I think XP kind of requires. So I think that's layered in there as well, right? So there was a certain tendency to, even a long time ago, copy the external forms of it, because I certainly saw people 15 years ago who were doing a stand-up and saying, we're scrumming, so that's interleaved with it.
Yeah, I think we have to talk a lot about Scrum, whether we want to or not. In terms of sort of the design of these frameworks or workflows or whatever you call them, XP, you could argue, like Matthew was kind of saying, maybe intentionally was designed to be resistant to ever crossing a chasm. With a name like that, it has to be good, like I said about Smuckers, but you might not talk about it a lot and it might not spread as well. And that might even be intentional. Scrum, on the other hand, seems like, if you look at how it fits into a product development ecosystem, or even ecosystems that aren't that, it seems like it was designed very cleverly to be taken up without necessarily forcing anyone to change anything. And we see this a lot. And because it's so prevalent, I feel like this is an important example to talk about here. So given that Scrum has it affords the option to inspect and adapt and be agile, but it also affords the option not to. Those are almost equally disposed. What do we do in these Scrum situations? Esther, you got something?
Well, I'm not going to say that it was intentionally designed that way. I don't know one way or another. I think, from the papers, the early papers I have read, was an empirical process and arriving at that. It did become rather frozen, right? And people do what people do, which is they take some new process and they overlay it on their existing system, right? And they may very well think they're doing it, right? But it conforms to their existing mental models, and it conforms to their existing cultural imperatives, and the existing processes influence what happens. So unless there's an effort to really look at what's holding those other processes, the other patterns in place, and soften those, it's really common for that overlay to just take on many of characteristics of the existing system. So, yeah. And it's certainly easier to do Scrum, to have, a number of meetings in a backlog than it is to undertake a rigorous XP. I mean, there's really no argument about that.
And so the other thing is, I don't think that the originators of Scrum have any more control over how Scrum is adopted today and how the diffusion of that innovation happened than the creators of XP had control over that. This is an organic system. This is there are certain things that happened with Scrum that because they happened, made it more likely to add to the pressures that we see that make late adopters, that add legitimacy and move toward adoption. Certification is one of them. Mm-hmm. Okay, certification adds legitimacy through the certification. It it makes it so that you have a professional field with everything from new job titles like product owner, like Scrum professional, like professional, those sorts of things are all around it. They add legitimacy. You have meetups, you have large organizations. All these things add legitimacy to a professional field. and therefore aid in adoption because they aid in those pressures. Those sorts of things. So when I'm talking about that there are no new adopters today of Agile, you cannot have an early adopter of Agile today, it would be as impossible as having an early adopter of email, right? If you go into a company and none of them use email and they're like, we're early adopters of email. It's like, well, you're the first adopter of email in your company, but you can't choose things like the protocol. You can't choose to have your email address be anything you want it to be. It has to conform to certain standards. You can't, even if in your company you said, okay, what we're going to do, because it's really effective, is we're going to write all of our emails in shorthand, then that's going to have effects. You're going to have pressures. Like if you send out a recruiting email in shorthand, the chances of you actually hiring anybody are pretty small. So there are all of these outside pressures that make it so that you have to conform to certain structures. And that's true of Agile today. There are lots and lots of pressures to conform to certain structures. The biggest example of this that I see is story points. Ron Jeffries, on a yearly basis, says, I may not have been the only person who came up with this, but I'm sorry anyway. Right? But if you have if you go into an organization who's never heard of Agile, they've never had any contact with Agile, I guarantee you that within a year, story points will come up. That's what I mean by no more early adopters.
Neil
We
has
have a hand
hand.
raised.
Hi, fascinating conversation. Thank you. Story points and some other things I see catch on is interesting because it's often the ones that feel less useful. Is that a feature we see? The things that actually catch on tend not to be the ones you'd wish to if you had a choice.
I think it's related to being being easy to copy, right? It's easy to copy that aspect of Agile practice because you just assign the points and it gets overlaid onto, well, this is just like estimation. It's not exactly like, well, we have someone who wrote a book on estimation on this call. George wrote a book, George Dinwiddie. So I think that's part of it, right?
Yeah.
Along with it's part of the canon. This is what you do.
And also there are a number of certification classes, like a large number of certification classes within the Agile community that teach story points. There are large conferences with talks that will have talks that include, introduction to Agile. Here's how you use story points. There are books that, on estimating in Agile. There are some that don't, but there's still a number that do. Excuse me. That talk about using story points. So it's already kind of baked in. And if we want to move past something like story points, then we actually have to build legitimacy in our professional field for different ways of doing it to move past that. And so when you see things like Troy McGinnis's keynote, talking about data-driven things at the Large Agile Conference a few years ago, those sort of things, we're actually, as a professional field, starting to delegitimize story points through these conversations. And that's another part of the curve. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is not the first time we've seen this. There's a paper that came out. When did the paper that mentioned waterfall come out?
73,
70s.
70s, and it actually didn't advocate waterfall. It was describing something, but once it took hold, it became normative, right? So this is not the first time we've seen that, and it took something pretty significant, to dislodge that as the dominant way of thinking about software development.
Yeah. So Amitai asked a really important question, which is, okay, fine. So what's different about what we need to do with this?
Mhm.
And I want to address that, because with early adopters, what we were really helping people do is find what is the, what's the best way to do this in your context. That's what they truly cared about. That was what was driving them to adopt Agile. What's the effectiveness gain? What's the efficiency gain? Those things. Today, people aren't adopting Agile for that. They may say they're adopting Agile for that, but it's kind of a what's called a self-myth. The reasons that most people are adopting Agile today have significantly more to do with legitimacy pressures. It's, they're considered negligent if they don't do it. They have board member pressure because they have a board member who was, heard about a startup that is, running them over, that is doing these things. And so we have to do these things. They have a VP who worked for another organization who was using Jira and it worked there. So we have to implement it here. Those are the reasons that people are adopting these things now. Also, you have mass numbers of people who, when you're hiring product people, when you're hiring others that are certified product owners who have gone through Scrum certification, who have gone through SAFe certification, and they have pressure, to be normative to their peers in these cases and those sorts of things. And so what we end up doing is seeing, especially now and moving forward, most of the organizations who wanted to adopt Agile purely for effectiveness gains have already done it. They've done it a while ago, right? Or they're not the ones calling in consultants. Yeah.
Another reason people adopted Agile early on was, and I think this has been explicitly stated by a number of people, is that they thought it would make life better for developers. So that it wasn't just, effectiveness was part of it, right? Effective software development, but also making software development more humane. And that was explicitly part of the Agile Alliance's statement at one point. I suspect it still is, but making software development more humane. And in another instance of, that whatever the new thing is conforming to the existing cultural pattern, in some ways, Agile has now become a way to exert more control over developers.
Yeah, we hear stories all the time of people whose experience of Agile is run away screaming, it was terrible. And it doesn't resemble what any of us would have meant. But that's the experience that they had under that name.
Yeah. And I think that, especially as a consultant, as somebody who's being hired in either as an internal or a Scrum Master or whatever, it would be very rare to find an organization whose purpose for adopting Agile today is to make developers' life more humane. That was, that's what we wished from the beginning. That is not the dominant form that emerged.
Yeah, it's not even to necessarily to deliver better software more reliably to our customers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So an interesting thing about that is that we, with the studies, we repeatedly see this. We can actually prove that it is not efficiency and effectiveness gains because that's the rational reason to adopt these things. And when we look at what are called administrative innovations, which is what Agile is, which is what TQM, which is what a number of these different things are. We've actually, for a number of years, gone in and studied organizations who do the adoption. And you can very quickly predict whether or not it's going to make things better by how people address the adoption. And in cases where they address the adoption as, how can we learn, how can we adapt this to our context, they can use almost any of these administrative innovations to make things better, because they're using it as a catalyst to learn and adapt their context. If they take it as a by the book, follow the rules, implement the solution without adapting to the context, they will get what academics call negative efficiency gains. Things will get worse. And we see this over and over and over again. But even though things get worse by doing it, following it by the book, they still call it a success. And that's not rational. Because they're not adopting it for efficiency and effectiveness gains. They're adopting it for legitimacy gains.
Although when you think back, 10, 15, 20 years ago, there were a lot of people saying, you have to start doing this by the book. You have to do it by the book. And then once you have done that, then you can start thinking about making any sorts of changes. I mean, I talked to someone who they had sent everybody to like a 2-day class, and then said, any changes to this process now must be approved by our software engineering process group. Right. So they were taking, and this is not this year. This was like, I don't know, at least it was before I moved up here. So it's at least 10 years ago. So and I think that's overlaying it that's the overlay of the culture. Right. Right. So there were a certain number of people saying, do it by the book, 15, 20 years ago. And, at least 10 years ago, probably 15, there were people who were already doing that. They're already saying, this is the book, this is it, no changes, no learning.
Yeah.
It's amazing to hear a story of, what is it, negative
Negative
gains?
efficiency gains.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
that's from a
they
paper.
had.
Yeah, that's from a paper from Westphal et al. That we're actually studying TQM adoption in hospitals and healthcare. And you could literally take that paper, scratch out TQM, write Agile in, and it would just read like a case study that we've all seen. Because this is not new to us.
Yeah.
That was written in the 1990s before Agile was even a widespread thing. This is a repeated pattern over and over and over again with these things.
So I would take issue, Matthew. Go ahead, Esther.
Well, I was gonna say that since it is a pattern, and I've been around long enough, 4 decades, to have seen this pattern happen a time or two. I should say that's 4 decades in the professional world, not just of my life. Since it is a pattern, we shouldn't be surprised about it. And perhaps we can learn more about how to interact with people at different parts of that cycle.
Yeah, I think I wanted to support that point, that I think people who are seeking legitimacy in particular in an organizational context are unlikely to be the people who will fight the design of that organization's incentives. They're more likely to be people who will attempt to follow them as best they can, whatever they believe them to be. I'm thinking of an analogy now that may inform our discussion about the medium late adopter phase that we're in, which is I do a lot of individual independent consulting for companies. But a few years ago, I went on a different kind of a gambit. I went on a coding tour where I specifically wasn't letting anybody pay me. They just covered my expenses and I would visit them. And I discovered a lot of things on that tour, but the one that's relevant right now here is which kind of companies would invite somebody to visit them for a week with what's at risk to them. I could waste their time. I could steal their intellectual property. I could I could introduce a dangerous bug into their code, all kinds of stuff. Which companies would think that that's a good idea versus which companies I usually get to consult for? Usually I get to consult for the kind of companies that struggle to change to Agile. And on a coding tour, I met companies that are really good at changing what they do. And you could see the evidence. They were really good at taking this random idea from a random person and deciding that it sounded good to them and they would act on it. And so I feel like almost by definition, this is a long-winded question, almost by definition, the companies that are struggling now are the ones for whom, like the companies that haven't gotten Agile yet are the ones for whom it's difficult. Because if it was easy for them, this is almost tautological, they would have gotten it already.
Yep.
But by the same token, there's also the self-reinforcing loops. It's like a strong attractor for a large company to have a hard time changing. So how do we take into account that not only are these usually big companies that are stuck, but they're big companies that are stuck and maybe have been stuck on this for a long time?
Yep. So that actually gets to the core of how do you coach a mid to late adopter company versus an early adopter, whatever. Because you were running into the innovators and the early adopters who wanted to eat up anything new. They were inviting you in to get anything they could out of you to adapt to their context. And here we go. The ones we generally work with are the late adopter companies. And so I'm going to say it again, which is the core thing that we have to look for is where is legitimacy coming from for these things. So they will not flat out tell you, we're only doing this because we're in a high state of uncertainty about our business, and therefore we want to mimic the couple of companies over there that we see as the successful players. You know, no one's going to come out and say that. However, there are clues about it. Like, how many times are they bringing up the Spotify model? Hey, we need to be more like a startup and use the Spotify model, or you know, or is a VP coming in and demanding that everyone use Jira because that was the tool that he used in another business unit, or those sorts of things. You can start looking for the clues of where is legitimacy coming from. And here's what here's the model that I want to put out there for people. When we talk about people doing this stuff in name only, when we talk about them, you know, doing just the ceremonial structure of it and not anything underneath. Again, institutional theory has a name for that. It's called decoupling. And we generally, as coaches, look at that and say, that's a problem. They're doing it in name only. They're a problem person. It's not a problem. It's a solution to a different problem. They're doing it for a reason. So here's what's going on. We're coming in, we are change agents coming in, and we're saying we're bringing with us the legitimacy of the Agile world. Here's the regulative, here's the rules, here's the structure that we're bringing with us. Here's the professional field that we're bringing with us as coaches, as Scrum masters, as change org people, that sort of stuff. And then also, here's the mimetic stories that we're bringing in. Here are the Spotifys, here are the Amazons, here are the Googles that we're giving stories about and that they've already heard stories about to do the new thing. So we have all of this pressure that we're bringing to bear to help them change. They have those exact same pressures from the way they're already doing things. They already have regulative pressure for how they're doing things. They already have professional normative pressure for how they've done it their entire life and their entire professional field up until this point. They already have mimetic pressure for things that have worked well in the past where they're at, and proof that this has worked in the past in their, in their experience for the stories that were there before, the IBMs, the for all of the different people that are there. Decoupling is when you are in a situation where you have competing pressures above from these two different things, and you have to fight and make both sides happy, right? And so what do? Well, you put on a facade and you do the outwardly facing in name only stuff when somebody is looking at you, and then you get work done the way you know how to get work done to get things out the door behind the scenes, and don't change at all. This is called decoupling. It's again really well researched. There's lots of stuff out there on it. And if you look at it from, oh, this is a solution, this is that they're taking, not a problem, then you can ask yourself, where are those pressures coming from? How can I help them gain more legitimacy from the new way of doing things, and help them figure out how to adapt the underlying new way of doing things to actually get work done? Help them understand the principles underlying it instead of just the facade. And then we're going to take care of their legitimacy concerns, and they will be much more able to actually do a full adoption. If we don't take care of that, then they're always going to be in the situation where it's called a double bind. And the term is the double bind, where you have two abstracts above you that you have to, they're competing, and you have to make them both happy, sort of thing. I liken it to, because I think we've all seen or can feel this, a teenager who is being cool in front of their friends, and then their mom walks in, right? And there's that, okay, so I can either anger my mom or look stupid in front of my friends, and I don't know what to do, and I'm really uncomfortable right now. That's the situation that all of these people who are doing stuff in name only, that's the pressure that they're under all the time. And if we just add more pressure to that, it doesn't help. If we actually help them understand where the pressure is coming from and how to solve it, then we can move forward.
So I want to go back to Amitai's story for a minute, and I think it relates to this in some way. Because what I heard you describing when you went on your coding tour was that companies had a certain amount of risk tolerance and a certain amount of trust, but because they trusted that, by reputation, they must have known something about your reputation, or from their interactions with you, they were willing to trust that you didn't have ill intentions. They trusted the people who worked there to be a good filter, to filter in the good stuff that would work for them and filter out the stuff that didn't fit for them. Or if you did do something goofy, to filter that out. Not that you would do anything goofy. So I think there's a level of risk tolerance and a level of trust for the people who work there that is also present for early adopters, right? And is not necessarily there in the companies that you described second, the ones that you generally get to work with. They don't, they want all of this external legitimacy, as Matthew has been talking about, and they don't trust their people to make sensible adjustments, right? You must run this past the software process engineering group before you make any little change based on learning. So I think in some ways, Matthew, what you're talking about is creating a little pocket of trust. Maybe not, organization wide, but at least creating a little pocket of trust that the person who is in that double bind at least is trusting you. That you're not another person who is going to be piling more pressures on their head.
Yeah, Matthew, the way you described it, it sounded really loudly in my head like an experience of mine. It resonated. And I'm sure you've seen it too, and a lot of the coaches here, that when we try to offer people an explanation of what test-driven development can be like, one of the failure modes in offering that explanation is that it sounds like we're inviting people to do some additional work on top of their work. And I know if it sounds like that to me, every chance I get, I'm turning that invitation down, right? But that's the trick. We're not, if we thought it was that, we wouldn't be selling it. We happen to know from our experience that it turns out that it saves your butt and you get done faster. And that's why we care so much about it. But people don't hear that from a typical explanation. And it sounds like in this case of decoupling that you're talking about, which I think is the same thing, that people will choose to take on more work in the scenario where they think they have to please both sides of a double bind, even if it doesn't have to be a double bind.
Yeah, one of the things that I actively try to do when I'm in a situation is, instead of telling people, the first thing I tell them is, if I ever tell you anything that is going to get you in trouble, do whatever, don't listen to me. Tell me about it so that I understand the context and so that we can have better conversations, but don't just blindly do what I say because I'm a consultant saying to do it. Like, that's the number one thing I set the level with everybody. And then after that, I ask questions like, do you know how to make your boss happy? Do you know what's expected of you by your peers? And we have conversations about what legitimacy already means to them without using those words. Then I ask them things like, do you know how to make me happy? How can I be more explicit about what I'm expecting from you? And how can we make that not a conflict? Those sorts of things. So those are the types of words that I use to try and get to these things that tend to be very effective.
So I think anytime you do something new, there's extra work. There's extra work with the learning curve. There's extra work with, just not being familiar with something, so it's going to take longer. And, adults generally engage in learning to solve some problem that's facing them, right? So in the context of what you're saying, Matthew, it's like the burden of learning becomes more palatable when they see some benefit regarding the legitimacy challenge.
Definitely that. And I try to not make myself a threat versus their current legitimacy. What I'm actively trying to do is figure out what stories are they using on both sides? What professional norms do they have on both sides? What rules and regulations do they have on both sides, to try and understand where their double binds are, so that we can try to get more coherency across that, because often they're assumed. When we talk about, as coaches, we have to have a lot of, be on the same page with management or those sorts of things, because if your pay structures and your management structures and your basically the influence from management and leadership are contrary to doing things in a new way, people aren't going to do it, right? So we have to know what the structures are that we're working in.
Well, and that goes back to the idea of, there's something holding the current pattern in place. And you have to understand what is holding that pattern in place in order to begin, loosening it enough that something else can take hold. Right? Or you're just going to be at the level of doing things in a very surface way.
Yeah. I think what institutional theory gives me is a name for those three main buckets of pressures. And I can look for what those three main buckets of pressures are in the system. But really, it's the same stuff, that you've been doing for years and that I've been learning from you for years.
Yeah. I'm responding to a chat.
Do we have a question or a comment there? We have lots of comments there.
Yeah.
I know my thoughts are going in about 8 different directions at the same time. I imagine that's true for lots of us.
Yeah, so I hear people talk about, meeting people where they are. And I think very often that the assumption that goes with that is that relates to their skills. You have to meet them where they are relative to their skills. So you can't expect somebody to, learn TDD in a day. You have to, there's a bunch of smaller skills that go into that. What I think we don't always pay enough attention to is meeting them where they are in terms of their larger system, what's holding things in place, and the pressures people are under. My boss told me that 25% of our portfolio of projects has to be agile by third quarter, which I heard someone say in probably about 2006 or 7. So it was happening way back then.
Yeah, we've been across that chasm for a long time. I'd say at least 2003.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet the way I'm thinking about how I want to say this. So I did some work in an organization where in part of the organization there was somebody with the Playbook from one of the big consulting companies, and he forced people to go by the Playbook. And I heard people talking about working with him. He forced us to do it. We didn't want to. He forced us. And those were the words people used to describe it. So that existed within that company. But the part of the company I was working in a much more organic way. So it is possible to find some places where you can work in a more organic, complexity informed way and work with what the system can do next, right? And maybe work with, maybe we'll put some of the forms in place, but we'll also be working on some of the thought processes at the same time. But I think it's hard for people who have been steeped in Agile for 20 years to acclimate to the, we've got to do this by the book. To the whole late adopter sort of approach, or it's not an approach, but the way they view things, where they're at. I think it's hard for a lot of people to feel like that's okay. It can feel frustrating. It can involve judgments.
One of the biggest frustrations that I see in Agile coaches going into those situations is that they just don't understand why people can't see how much better this will be. You know, they say they brought me in here for effectiveness gains, and I'm showing them a better way. And they're not just running for it. They're not just trying to eat it up. And the reason they're not just trying to eat it up is because they have a lower level concern, which is, how do I keep my job? How can I keep my boss happy? How can I keep my self-image of who I am as a professional? All of those legitimacy concerns aren't met first. As soon as they meet those, they will be significantly further along and able to actually go after the, okay, now I can make it better. Now I can make my life more humane. Now I can make my work more humane. I can get the effectiveness gains. I can do all that stuff. But if we don't, it's like a Maslow's Triangle thing. If you don't take care of the base level, then they can't move past to that. They're always going to have that survival concern in the back of their head. And I see a lot of coaches get really frustrated at that. And change agents and Scrum Masters get frustrated at the fact that people aren't just jumping for that because they're not taking care of those lower level concerns first.
Well, Bob pointed out in the chat that maybe a strategy is to find the folks who in the company who are interested. You know, they're not early adopters, but they might be eager learners, right? And work with them. And Jerry Weinberg used to call that going with the energy. So you go where the energy is, and that in itself can create, you know, maybe a little internal pressure or attraction, as I like to talk about it. You know, if people can see that, oh, it's not so bad, it's working, they're, you know, they seem to be happier, you know, that can also be a form of pressure. Maybe not exactly the ones, I mean, maybe it's becomes you know,
Normative.
a normative or mimetic, you know, within the context, right? So I think there's an alternative to saying, you know, with, because I fear this could be the message that some people get, is that with late adopters, which is everybody now, you have to go with the form, you know, the form only, right? I think you can approach it in a number of different ways.
Yes. Oh, if anybody is getting out of what I'm saying that you have to go with form only because it's late adopter, please do not take that from this in any way, shape, or form. That is a recipe for disaster. Do not. It will actively make things worse. Yeah. So Esther, thank you for saying that might be one of the things. It's like, no, I love the idea of finding the people in an organization who don't have the legitimacy concerns. They're the ones who are already, they've found a way to take care of that. Either they're, you know, rebels or outcasts tend to be the people that it's like, oh, okay, yeah, I don't care about those things. It doesn't affect me. So yes, let's learn. And yeah, find them, start there, build great stories. That's awesome. I find fewer and fewer of those people in the organizations I'm working with these days. But when you find them, absolutely help them. Like, great.
Well, so I'm thinking back to when I did work for as an employee for a big corporation, and there were, it was in the financial industry, so it was pretty risk averse and pretty change insulated from change by design. You know, the financial firms don't like things to change quickly very often. And yet there were many pockets of people doing things not by the book in that in that company. There was, I was, ostensibly had these big, year-long, 2-year-long projects, but I was, we were delivering working code every few weeks and testing it, and it could have gone into production had it, had we been able to segment it properly, which we weren't, but, so it's possible that there are groups like that. I mean, there was another group that they wanted to stay together as a team, so they bid on projects. Not everybody in the company knew about it, but the people in their department, had recognized that this is a crackerjack team, and rather than break them up, we're gonna let them keep going this way. And so they would actually say, yeah, no, that project, if you shift these things, we'll do it. So there's always, little pockets, even in really stodgy companies. And I think that when you are contracting, you can have some sort of exploration about that as part of how you contract. It's like you don't have to accept everything that, the client says. You can negotiate and say, I want to work with a team who has applied to be part of this project, or has indicated they have some interest in trying something new. So make it sort of an application process. So you get somebody who is more likely to be interested. So you don't have to go along with, we're going to do 20 teams at the same time. You can say, our experience is you'll have much better results if we start with one. And see if we can get it working there.
I have maybe a good closing question, unless other folks have other questions. You can, of course, ask more. I'm happy to stick around as long as we want to. I think this is a really tough nut to crack, and I think it's part of a reinforcing loop that keeps things hard to change for big companies. I know the first time that I was brought in as a coach anywhere, it was for a contract with a duration of 1 year. And that's because the company that brought me in had an annual budget cycle. And I think that's a lot of the companies we're talking about have that. And I think as long as the feedback loop for a decision like, did Amitai make a dent with that team, is a year long, nothing's going to change in any appreciable amount of time, because there's not enough information and not enough chances to change. So what can we do to sort of break through this annual budget cycle? What are some things that can help? Or how do we work around it?
Well, you don't have to wait for a year to have feedback. I mean, you can build in all sorts of little feedback loops along the way. And I often talk about them as steering signals. So you look for the subtle signs and the interim indications that things are moving in a more desirable direction. Right. So you don't have to wait a year. And, that's something you can talk about when you're contracting. And you probably have a legal contract, which is, sits over there, but I'm talking more about the agreements you make with the person you're going to be working with most directly. So, I mean, yeah, a year-long feedback loop is not terribly helpful to anyone, but you don't have to accept that. Figure out what the steering signals are going to be.
So folks, I know, like I said, my thoughts are racing. We have a chance here to ask Esther and Matthew anything that might be on our mind. What have you got? Anything come to mind that you want to ask about from what they talked about, or a situation that you're in? Maybe some context-free advice that you could get while we're here on your situation, sort of generic. Feel free to pipe up with a question or raise your hand or type it into the chat. Because we have some wisdom here. We should take advantage more than we have. have some wisdom in the chat too.
Yep.
I see Bob's hand is up.
So what Esther said about negotiating and what Amitai said about the importance of at the start, and I put this into the chat, says to me or reinforces for me the importance of negotiating before you even start the engagement to maximize the chances that the first level of engagement is going to be successful and set a precedence for the rest of the contract.
Mhm.
Not easy, but nothing worth doing ever is.
You can always write into your contract that they can fire you at any time.
There you go.
In case they were wondering.
I mean, I'm serious about that. If you want, to have shorter feedback loops than 1 year, then write into the contract. It's like, okay, cool. We will revisit this contract every month or every 2 weeks or whatever, and see whether or not it's worth continuing.
Yeah, I don't think they even have to be written into the main contract, but they certainly have to be discussed with the person you're going to be working with most directly. And sometimes a level up from that. How are we going to know we're making any progress? I mean, I worked for a company where, they implemented this methodology, and, they didn't have any, the only metrics they had were the number of people trained. Anybody ever have that experience with Agile? So, you can train lots of people, but you don't know if anything in your system is actually changing. And the methodology is actually their fourth or fifth attempt to fix that problem, because their feedback loops were always too long, right? But so you don't have to have it in the contract, but you certainly have to have it in the agreements that you have with the people you're working with. Social contract, yeah, as George is saying. I had another thought in my head, but it went away.
Yeah. I've also got another thought that doesn't come up in these conversations very much, so I want to insert it. It's a little bit of a tangent, which is the pressures that we're talking about on the Agile side, the regulative, normative, and mimetic. We as individuals don't control those. But as a professional field, we reinforce them.
Mhm.
And so this group of people right here, how we work with people, how we work at conferences, the talks that are given, all of these things, in a very large way, reinforce the norms of our professional field. I have been kind of vocal for a while about the fact that the tools on the floor of the large conferences are the equivalent of writing cricket on a baseball bat and selling it to people. That things like Jira and Rally and all of these other things that are sponsored as Agile tools and those sorts of things are writing Agile on traditional project management tools and those sorts of things, and are a large part of our community, those sorts of things. And so on taking a step back, I think that we need to have a serious discussion about, as a profession, what do we accept? I for a long time have said I have no problem with certifications. Certifications give legitimacy, they do those sorts of things. I want my lawyer to be a member of the bar. I want my doctor to be a certified doctor, certified by the board. I have no problem with certifications, especially strong ones. I have a problem with weak certifications that provide legitimacy for nothing. Those are conversations that I think are worth having as a professional field that we need to help shape So I'll leave that out to the people here.
Well, those conversations have been going on for, close to 20 years. Right. There's been a lot of conversation about that. And there are other factors that seem to be exert a stronger force. So, yeah, have the conversation.
Collective action, rise up.
That exact conversation did take place back in around 2011, before the Agile Coaching Institute was launched just a few months later. A question was put to a group of Agile professional leadership meetup group: is Agile coaching a profession? Should it be? And it got deep into the exact two examples that you lawyers, doctors, professional associations, being in and not being in, and hence not being able to practice, going all the way back to the guilds in the Renaissance. And so those conversations absolutely took place.
Well, they took place long before that as well.
I no doubt.
Yeah.
First time I encountered them anyway.
Well, so this is a little sidebar, but coaching is not a regulated profession.
It is not, thank God.
And a big focus of the ICF is keeping it that way. And a big focus of their process is making sure that there is no professional liability. So, yeah, but that's another big topic. It's a different topic.
Also a good one.
Yeah.
Any last questions for Esther or Matthew before we wrap up?
Well, if I can make a comment on this last point. I was on the Scrum Alliance Board of Directors for a couple of years right after Ken Schwaber left. And it's during that time that they came up with the idea of there actually having to be a test to take, as opposed to just sitting in class. And so the Scrum Master test, regardless of how good or bad it was, it came up. But there was also some discussion that I kind of promoted, which was, and this is in line with lots of other certifications and software I was familiar with, where it was irrelevant where you got your training from. If you're going to have to pass a test, then you pass the test, and you could get trained anywhere. Well, a couple of things resulted from that. First of all, at the Scrum Alliance meeting in Barcelona, a number of European certified Scrum Master trainers said that if the Alliance did that, they would quit, walk away, and go join Ken. They would not accept the fact that people could get training from other than them to become Scrum Masters. And then, of course, Ken very cleverly in scrum.org basically said, you don't have to take training from anybody as long as you can pass my test, which I thought was ironic given the attitude of the certified Scrum Masters, certified Scrum trainers. So yeah, there are a lot of discussions about certification and stuff that happened years ago, and for various reasons of protection, which is one reason that things like guilds and societies were formed. One complained about, yes, it's wonderful to have doctors and lawyers and all these people who have some level of serious qualification through demonstration of actual performance, judgment by their peers. But it also means in those organizations, people in those organizations are often very unwilling to criticize themselves and one another. My wife was in the medical profession. She just watched doctors refuse to criticize other doctors who had clearly performed in an incompetent fashion because they were afraid of retaliation. And then they'd lose their job because they had to be in that organization to be allowed to practice. So there are a lot of pros and cons about certification bodies and strengths of certification bodies. And I don't think that will change, certainly not in the software field.
No, I look at it from a sociologist perspective, just of at a, the 5,000 foot view, that the certifications, the fact that Scrum has certifications, and the fact that the Scrum.org decided to give those, is I can look back and historically see things that did provide legitimacy to Agile, and is one of the reasons that both Agile is still a thing today in businesses, and is, start one of the things that formed the professional norms that are why Scrum adoption is what it is today. So good and bad. Just from the system of how the social system of how these things work, that was one of the things that gave legitimacy to it. So.
Well, I think we could go in any of these directions for as long as people have food, water, and toilets handy. But I think we should cut it short here. I really, really appreciate having had both of you here. I want to ask both of you in turn. Matthew, what do you have going on, if anything, like in conference talks or workshops or books or podcast appearances besides Esther's? And where can people get in touch with you if they want to follow up from what we talked about today?
So I don't have any books or anything's really announced yet. I have a couple things in process. I'm at Industrial Logic. If you want to get a hold of me, you can get a hold of me through Industrial Logic. I stay active on Twitter in social media so that I can have at least some influence on that conversation and the social norms and those sorts of things. And when the pandemic passes, we'll see about conferences again. So haven't done much with that at the moment, but thank you for asking. Oh, I'm
and Twitter
Carlson_SB on Twitter. Yeah.
And Carlson_SB on Twitter. I did put it in the chat earlier, so hopefully people can find it there. And Esther, how about you? What do you have going on, and how can people be in touch?
What I have going on? Well, there's my podcast, Change by Attraction. I just realized that this Wednesday is the last Wednesday in the month, so there'll be a new episode coming out on Wednesday. I also do a monthly free webinar on a topic of my choice that happens the last Tuesday of the month. And this month I'm going to be talking about trust. And then I'm taking December off, but they'll be back in January. I am working on a second edition of Agile Retrospectives with Diana Larson and David Horowitz. So that will be coming out sometime next year. And I'm going to be relaunching my retrospectives class and my Change by Attraction class, probably next year. So that's what's up for me. Esther Derby on Twitter. And you can watch my 10-minute explainer on retrospectives on my YouTube channel. So.
Lovely. Fantastic. Thank you. I want to remind folks, again, if you missed it before, this video will be going to YouTube. So this right about now is your last chance to get in touch, or you could email me after the fact. If you somehow appeared by mistake and didn't mean that, it's still possible for me to blank you out. Otherwise, we're really happy to have your participation, of course. And with that, one more thing. We had at least one request in the chat for a bibliography from this talk. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to listen through it for all the references and see if I can get them together. And if I need any help, Esther and Matthew, I'll ask you.
Yeah, I also have kind of a standard lit review for a bunch of this stuff, papers I can point people to and things like that. So I'll compile a small greatest hits of the theories behind the stuff that I was talking about and send that on to you.
It'll be like going to graduate school.
Yeah, I went to graduate school, so you didn't have to. I read through a bunch of these papers. I'm happy to have the conversation, but I can also give you the source material.
We can borrow legitimacy from you. Thank you. And with that, thank you both, Esther and Matthew. It was wonderful to have you here. And thank you, audience, for joining us and sharing your
Yeah,
wisdom
thanks
and
for
asking your
coming,
questions.
everybody.
Really
Thanks
a lot
for
of fun.
inviting
Thank you.
Thanks for showing up.
Thanks for having us.
See you next time.